Honorable participants, dear colleagues, for me also it's a great honor and pleasure to be here. That's the reason why I have to thank the Institute for Cultural Democracy for inviting me and for giving me the possibility to speak here. Of course, like the previous speaker, Mr. Gunnarsson, I came with great pleasure, of course, here. But in the difference with him, I don't need to Google ICD because I have been here many times and I know the huge work done from the cultural democracy and personally from Mr. Dunfried, and I have cooperated very closely with the Institute in previous years, except in the last 2 years. That's the reason why I had today a big problem for finding the building of the cultural democracy, going around the old building for 1 hour with my wife and also thinking that where is disappeared the building. So, but at last I found it and I came here a little bit late. So, of course, it is spoken. I think that I choose this because I have contributed with different let's say, speeches in this conference with students and other participants, with colleagues from different countries. But this time I decided, I thought to speak for the Universal Declaration on Human Rights because it is this year the 17th anniversary. It's very important, and these anniversaries, of course, it is very important to celebrate because it is the possibility to look back, to evaluate, to pay homage to the persons engaged in the field of human rights for what they have done, but also to see what happens today and also to put objectives for the future, which of course needs to be improved because human rights are a very sensitive issue and very important issue because it is closely linked with problems with has to do domestically but also internationally with peace and security in the global level. Of course, we have to say at the beginning, just at the beginning, because that being aware of that fact, United Nations just at the beginning wanted to promote as strong as possible human rights. In the framework of the League of Nations, for the first time, the community, international community, tried to do something formally, institutionally, in the field of human rights. For example, the international criminal responsibility. They tried to punish the persons who were found responsible for the First World War. It was not successful because mainly the Kaiser of Germany, Wilhelm II, was not, let's say, catched because he was protected at that time from the Netherlands. But even it was the effort. It was of course it was also good. The international mandate, the state who controlled and protected, let's say, the other states had the obligation in the framework of the Charter of the League of Nations to report for the state of human rights in these territories. The question of minorities, a very important issue. Almost all states who applied for being part of the League of Nations had to sign a special agreement with the League of Nations that they will be engaged in the future to respect minorities, because the League of Nations was aware for the problems created after at the peace conference first, and they were of course aware of the problems for the future. The protection of refugees, especially with the Institute. It was first a special person who was in charge of that issue, Friedrich Nansen, and later James MacDonald, who raised in the 30s the problem of the refugees and also the discrimination of the Cheifs in Germany in the 30s, but he was not heard, and he withdrew. He resigned from his the feminist movements and so on. But as I said before, the United Nations took it very seriously. Even here, it's maybe the case to remember the Declaration of the Allies in 41, in the Declaration of the Atlantic for free freedoms, which will be, or which were foreseen as a basic war aims: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from fear, and freedom from want. Also to remember the Charter of the United Nations, which has 7 references to human rights. In preamble, Article 1, Article 55 and 56, mainly 55, who declares the objective of the United Nations to protect human rights, and Article 68, who foresee of the Charter, who foresee the creation of a special commission in the framework of ECOSOC to protect human rights, which now has changed beginning from 2006 in the Council of Human Rights with the center in Geneva. But of course, this engagement was without making any definition of human rights. That's the reason why later on in this framework of the duties laid down in the Charter of the United Nations, it was created this committee, the Committee of Human Rights, and who prepared the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And for their engagement, without taking so much time to you, I will mention here quite shortly the personalities, like among 8 main specialists who were engaged at that time for that issue. John Humphrey, who was working that time in the Secretary of the United Nations. René Cassin, a very well-known jurist, and he won also for his engagement in the field of human rights the Nobel Prize in '68, in the 10th anniversary of the 20th anniversary of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. He was also later judge and also president of the European Court on Human Rights in Strasbourg, and even today the street before the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg has his name, and also prizes are in the name of René Cassin. Charles Malik, a philosopher and professor from Lebanon, who was engaged very strongly and in this field, and working also as professor in United States of America. Chang from China, even it is mentioned also Bogomolov from, it was the ambassador of the Soviet Union, but also if you see the discussions and the tolerance from the other participants in that, let's say, preparatory work, of course, you see what tolerance was given that time, because the international community was aware that a compromise should be found to approve this very important document with this. I let as the last, but for me it was the most important person who was engaged for the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, Eleanor Roosevelt, the ex-wife of President Roosevelt, who was really very strongly engaged in this field in the time of League of Nations against discrimination, against for the protection of African, of Asian, and Japanese Americans. And it's very interesting to mention here also her engagement for protection of Japanese Americans after the Pearl Harbor attack of Japan to the American bases in Pearl Harbor. But she was also very well known. That's the reason why President Truman called her the first lady of the world for her engagement. He was engaged for discrimination. He pushed also President Truman to support the creation of the United Nations, and also to put in the Charter these articles in which are clearly, very clearly, mentioned the objective for protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms. And Frau Eleanor Roosevelt called the declaration as Magna Carta for everyone and everywhere. Let's speak shortly, very shortly, for the content of the convention. There are 30 articles. It's practically the first enumeration of human rights by the United Nations. The preamble recognizes the inherent dignity and equal rights for all members of the human family in the name of freedom, justice, and peace. This declaration seeks to support the cooperation of United Nations with the member states. And it is also, there are three main premises of the declaration. First, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in rights. Secondly, the need to take measures for the effective measures for the implementation of human rights in the daily life. And third, application without any discrimination. This is very, very important, of course, without discrimination because the race, of color, sex, religion, political and other opinions, origin, property, and so on. If we divide in groups human rights in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, we will classify it in 5 groups. The first group is gathered inherent personal rights, rights such the right to life, liberty and security, not to be held in slavery or servitude, prohibition of torture, equality, and so on. Secondly, personal rights, effective remedy in national level, not arbitrary arrest or detention, fair and public hearing, presumption of innocence, nulla poena, sine lege, not to be punished without law, and ne bis in idem, not twice for the same evidence, privacy, and so on. Third, rights relating political life, freedom of thought, conscience and religion, freedom of opinion and expression, peaceful assembly or association, periodic elections, equal access to public services, and so on. Fourth, economic and social rights, property rights, economic, cultural, and social rights, free development of personality, the right to work, the right to rest, which was mentioned also before, the right to have health service, etc. And lastly, the rights concerning the social and judicial life, the right to leave the country, which was very important. I will stress it. It is Article 13, and Eleanor Roosevelt mentioned, because I don't mention in the Assembly, the Universal Declaration was voted 70 years ago at the 10th of December, and 48 states were in favor, only 8 states were against. They made an abstention, not against. No state was against. 2 states because the reason of Saudi Arabia and South Africa for the question of discrimination, and so they were not sure. But the next 6 countries were the Soviet Union and other socialist blocs. And Eleanor Roosevelt mentioned that the reason was Article 13, because the freedom to leave the country in case the human rights were violated extremely. That's the reason why she mentioned these countries were ready at that time to ratify or to give their vote in favor of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Shortly, legal problems of the... At the beginning, it was the discussion to have it like a treaty or like a declaration. A declaration, of course, we all know has moral and political weight for member state without legal compulsion, but as convention, of course, legally binding for member states who accepted it. One, the first version, the version supported, I repeat, mainly from Mrs. Roosevelt, because she believed at the time that the declaration will have more effect, like United States Declaration on Independence. And she was right that time, because formally the Universal Declaration, it's not binding, but we all know that practically the Universal Declaration has been adopted or influenced and inspired most national, being as declaration, most national constitutions after 48, also national and international law, the creation of regional, sub-regional, and national institutions are mentioned, is mentioned quite specifically in many constitutions, like the Constitution of Spain, the Constitution of the last constitution, the last new state created in Europe, Kosovo, for example, the constitution mentioned it, but also is inspired the European Convention of Human Rights. In the preamble, it's quite clearly, in the preamble, in the paragraph number 2 and number 3, it is quite clearly mentioned that the European Convention of Human Rights is inspired from the United Declaration on Human Rights. With other words, of course, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights has been and still is like the constitution of human rights. For the first time in international law also, the term rule of law is used in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. What is also very important to mention is that the fact to mention that while not a treaty, the declaration was explicitly adopted for the purpose of defining the meaning of the words fundamental freedoms and human rights, appearing, as I mentioned, appearing in the Charter, which is binding. Charter is binding, of course, for member states. This is very important to emphasize. It is Article 25 and Article 103 of Charter, which mention quite clearly Article 25, the engagement of all states, member states of the United Nations, to implement the resolutions of the Security Council, and Article 103 said that in case of conflict in international international norms with Charter, prevails the norms of Charter. This is quite clear. That's the reason why, for many international lawyers believe that the declaration, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, forms part of customary international law. This is very important for jurists to mention it. And is a powerful tool in applying diplomatic and moral pressure to governments that violate its articles. Also, the declaration has served as the foundation of two binding United Nations Convention on Human Rights, International Pact on Civil and Political Rights of '66, and International Pact on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights of '67. And lastly, it's very important to mention that principles of declaration, of United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, are elaborated in different human rights treaties, adopted in the framework of the United Nations, such as Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, Convention on the Rights of Child, Convention Against Torture, Ill and Degrading Treatment, Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers, and many other conventions and treaties approved in the framework of the United Nations. Now, quite shortly to mention the case of Albania, 2, 3, let's say, notes shortly. I have worked, I actually in the Supreme Court, but before I've worked also in the Constitutional Court of Albania. And we have mentioned, it is not mentioned in the Constitution, but we have mentioned the Universal Declaration in many judgments. For example, in the judgment for the abolition of the death penalty in Albania, which was a very important judgment, and we quoted the right to life mentioned firstly in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Also in judgments in which we have treated problems linked with the prohibition of torture, with judgments in which are treated standards of the fair trial, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, and so on. In many judgments we have mentioned it because thinking always that Universal Declaration on Human Rights has the status of the customary international law. It was mentioned also, I would like to say something about the religion. That's the reason why we have mentioned it quite all, because religion today, especially today, it's very important. It's touched also from the president of Latvia, an excellent speech about religion and the nationalism. I would like that to stress here that it is mentioned in some decisions of the Constitutional Court also in Albania. But what I'd like to say here is that as a small country, as a country living for a long period in a dictatorship, Albania, of course, we need first to give to international law, as I mentioned before, a special place. And that's the reason why we are very lucky that our Constitution of '98 speaks as for international law in general, that in cases of conflicts prevail the norms of international law, but also in Article 5 of the Constitution it is mentioned that the Republic of Albania apply the international law that is binding upon it, which is very important because it's not a simple declaration. We think that here, with the framework of this article, and we have had the possibility to interpret in such a way, are also the so-called jus cogens and obligations with the character erga omnes. This is very important to give life also in that way, also the rights mentioned directly in the framework of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. As regards human rights, as I mentioned, we quote in Article 17 the European Convention of Human Rights. In our Constitution is stressed that, speaking about the possible limitation of human rights, it is stressed that limitations cannot exceed the standards of the European Convention of Human Rights. And this helps a lot, all jurists, but especially the judges, that in these cases, in the cases of limitations of all rights, they have the obligation to see the standard. They have the obligation to see the jurisprudence of the European Convention of Human Rights. It helps a lot. And this is not the case for many countries, other countries of the Council of Europe, 47 countries of the Council of Europe and parties in the European Convention on Human Rights. And for the religion, I would like to say that, of course, as a country being for a long period under a dictatorship, and religion was prohibited at that time for more than 35 years, around 35, 40 years, and people were sent in prison because saying that I believe in God that time. It was a famous article in the criminal code, agitation and propaganda, and even for that expression or hearing music, they were sent in prison. Agitation and propaganda was qualified and punished from 3 till to 10 years. But after the changings, of course, and during this period, of course, in a hidden way, the relations with the religious communities were very, very good. So if we need to import many standards, it is spoken quite often from international experts too, in many fields of human rights, we can import our standards of tolerance and understanding between different religious groups in Albania. We have four main religious groups: Muslims, which are formally the majority, Catholics, Orthodox, and Bektashins, which is part of the Muslims. But as I repeat, that their relations with these groups are a very good example. I can tell you, let's say, two small stories, real stories. In fact, in 89, after the death of the dictator in 85, then it was a little bit of liberalization and the opening of Albania. And then after 35 years, it was taken the initiative to open the religious institutions. And both institutions were opened in the northern part, so for the first time after, let's say, 40 years in Shkodra. And first it was opened a church in this city, supported also from Vatican, the ceremony. And in the ceremony took part all of the city, including all Muslims of the city. And after a week at the same city, it was opened the first moschee. And also the Catholic community participated in the ceremony, even supporting materially the Muslim community for the organization of the. That's the reason why I would like to stress that the understanding and tolerance, it's a very good example. I don't, as an Albanian, not saying only myself, but also international experts. We had, before 2 years, we were in the role of vice presidency in the Council of Human Rights of the United Nations, and it was organized in this framework, a very important big conference on religion, and taking in Albania, international conference, taking as an example Albania. And I will finish with a small joke, also I repeat the very nice jokes told from Mr. President before that, about to tell that it's not place for fundamentalism in Albania. After reopening the institutions in Albania, first in Shkodra and then in the other cities and villages of the country, mosques and churches, somebody is asked to be a priest of the mosque and from the community. And they said, please go, you are clever, you can fulfill this, and we need as soon as possible your answer, and you will profit, let's say, X sum for this job. He said that, yes, with pleasure, but I need a little bit more, that I have the community, the family, excuse me, but I will think, but you have to increase me a little bit the payment. And after some days, let's say, he had no answer, and he went there and said, you have any answer, because I need it. They said, no, we are thinking, we think to fulfill it, but please let's wait another week. He said that, yes, I will wait another week, but please, after a week, you give me that answer, because the other village near is asking me, expressing me to be the priest of the church there. So you understand? It was asked to be priest in the mosque, and waiting to have the permission, and he pressed them, please give me the answer, because the other community, the Catholic community, is asking me to be the priest of the Catholics. So I would like to say here that there is no basis for fundamentalism in Albania. The religions communicate, and it's a big tolerance. But sometimes also in these countries it's a risk, also including the Balkans, because we should be very careful, because we know that fundamentalism is very dangerous. It's very dangerous for all, for democracy. It's very dangerous for rule of law, and also it's very dangerous for for human rights. Thank you.